Well, hello and welcome to the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint live series. My name is Guy Stevens. I am your host. I'm also the executive director of the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint. Excited to have you here. As always, we actually have a special, this is our every other week presentation. So we have a special presentation for you here today. So I'm really excited to have you join us for that. If you're not familiar with who we are, the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint was started about 5 years ago. We are a nonprofit, started in Maryland, but acting nationwide and you could say worldwide. We have people from around the world that are connected to us, and we care about a lot of issues. We started around the issue of restraint and seclusion, but we care about a lot of the things often being done to kids, very often in the name of behavior, whether it's restraint, seclusion, suspension, expulsion, or corporal punishment. We, of course, are always trying to influence changes in the way that people approach children, and we believe in a trauma-informed, neuroscience-aligned, relationship-driven, a collaborative, and neurodiversity-affirming approach. And we are working to affect changes in policy and practice and hopefully create better environments for kids, for teachers, and for staff. And they're really excited to have you here today. So this is actually a special event. We usually meet every other Thursday. But, you know, as is often the case, we have things that pop up and I get excited about. I'm like, hey, we should add another event. Sometimes there are things that happen to be particularly timely, like maybe a new book. And that's what we have to talk about today with you. So we try to get those so that we can do them. We're actually already, I think, booked out a year in advance right now. We've got so many great programs in store for you in the coming year. So sometimes we have to kind of put something in on one of those additional weeks. So those of you that have been here before, you know what the drill is, and it makes me really happy when people will take a moment and put a comment in the chat and let us know who you are and where you're from. It's always great to see. It's great to see old friends and new friends and all sorts of people that happen to join us all the time. So I'll mention here briefly, and I'm going to do an introduction here in a moment. I've got Katie Pagnotta joining us today and going to be talking about a brand new book. And I think you'll be excited to hear about this, and I'm excited to share it with you. But before we get into kind of the main event, I do want to just take a moment and let you know that we do have a couple of sponsors that have been helping us, with bringing the broadcast to you. One of those sponsors, who's actually been kind of a full year sponsor for us here, is Supportable Solutions. Supportable Solutions is a educational consulting company run by a friend and a colleague and an amazing human that's doing some really fantastic work. That not only is helping to move people away from punitive approaches, but really helping to create much better environments for again, teachers and students and everyone. And Supportable Solutions is now known for a product called the Y Toolkit. And I'm going to share with you a little promo here about the toolkit.
This updated functional behavioral assessment and behavior intervention plan is a game changer. For once, parents don't feel like they're being blamed for their child's behavior. This web-based assessment guides support teams along their journey to discover the causes of distress behavior in individuals, all while, at the same time, utilizing a visual approach to help shift perspectives. The Y Toolkit helps educators and others ask the right questions when a child is struggling with behavioral challenges, leading to answers that will build regulatory capacities and robust nervous systems. I highly recommend it. The Y Toolkit is a testament to the fact that we all do well if we can.
So I want to thank Supportable Solutions for being a sponsor. Any of you, if you've had the experience that I've had and you hear functional behavioral assessment, you might kind of go, because those assessments are not always good. They're not always helpful. They're often kind of blaming, shaming children and putting all of the onus on a child when there are challenges. And this approach, this Y Toolkit, really is about getting to the deeper why behavior. It's a great approach, and it's a program that can be used by schools for children, and it's something you can advocate for as well if you're a parent. So something great. I want to thank Supportable Solutions for being a sponsor here of the podcast. So with that, let's get to what we're here to talk about today. And I want to take a moment to introduce our guest. Katie Pagnotta is a licensed clinical mental health counselor. functional success educational consultant, parent coach, and author. She's also the creator of the Brain and Body Aligned Responsive Systems, BBARS of Excellence Framework, and we're going to talk about that today. She guides educators, administrators, and school staff in strengths-based approaches that leverage the human design and empower the development of necessary mindsets and habits that lead to re-envision success balance with wellness and goal attainment. Katie recently published a book, Empowered by the Human Design, utilizing the BBARS of Excellence Framework to foster student and educator success. This includes interview segments with 18 experts within the fields of education, psychology, and neuroscience. The book is a work of collective wisdom grounded in the Polyvagal Theory and synthesized in a user-friendly way to facilitate practical applications for educators. Its reviewers have called it a powerful and practical new model for regulation and resilience, required reading for all educators, a gift to the field, a game changer. Throughout the book, Katie combines the wisdom of her interviewees and her own research, as well as her years of experience as a former K-12 New Hampshire public school counselor. During time as a school counselor, Katie has witnessed a pattern which educators were working passionately and students were doing the best they could within the skills, with the skills and support they had. And yet educator attrition rate, as well as youth mental health crisis, were continuing to rise. Knowing that when educators and school systems as a whole are given the right tools, they can provide fertile soil for to nurture the environments, relationships, and support necessary students, what's necessary for students to thrive. Katie left her role as a school counselor to become an educational consultant who provides these tools through the BBARS of Excellence Framework. So, Katie, welcome. We're really excited to have you here today. You, of course, have this book that you have put into the world as a way to make a positive difference, and we're excited to have you here and excited to talk about the book.
Thank you so much, Guy. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here today.
I appreciate that. And, you and I connected, probably a few months ago, maybe. And you'd been kind enough to send me a copy of the book. I began to dive in, and we had an opportunity to meet and talk a little bit. And, it sounds like you have been probably on a very similar journey to the journey that I've been on, and many of the folks in our audience, and they're part of our community, people that have kind of moved in a direction of getting aligned with some of the neuroscience out there, understanding behavior, whether their own or the behavior of children, through a different lens, and then realizing that new lens meant a new approach. And often that work is led by the recognition of a need, or the recognition that some of the things that we're doing are not working the way that we intend. And, it's really easy for us sometimes to continue to do the same things over and over again, although they're not working. And that's why, work like yours is important, because there's a point where, we have to ask the questions, and we have to look around, and we have to think about, how do we create a system? How do we address the needs and change? So I appreciate the journey that you've been on, and realize that, it's probably a journey that aligns well with a lot of the folks here in our community. So excited to dive in and learn more about not only the book, but kind of what led you to that as well. So we're going to dive in, and I'm going to try to get to know you a little better. And you and I have had a chance to talk, but we'll get to know you a little better, for the audience that's watching as well. And again, if you're watching live, let me know in the chat who you are and where you're from. I know there's a number of you on live right now, and it's always great to see who people are and where they're joining us from. So don't be shy. Please jump on and let us know. So why don't we go back in time a little bit? You of course, in your bio, I mentioned that you were working in schools. You were a school counselor, and during your time, working with teachers and working with students, saw teachers that were working really, really hard. Saw students that were, doing their best, but also saw at times that things weren't working the way that they should. Tell us a little bit about your experience, as a counselor, And what were you seeing in schools?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I worked in a few different schools. I worked in a high school, and then I worked in two different K-8s, as well as having experience talking with lots of different colleagues and educator friends and family in lots of different districts and schools, and really just seeing similar patterns over time in teachers just being passionate about what they're doing, loving being able to support kids, but really working tirelessly and really seeing that they were spinning their wheels in ways that oftentimes were leading to their own burnout, an imbalance of their support of students without really supporting themselves, lots of unhealthy mindsets that were happening with all good intention, but behaviors that were leading to not the level of success that I knew was possible. And at the same time, as you had read in the bio, really seeing that students were continuing to experience mental health challenges, behavioral challenges, and not seeing that they were getting the support that they really needed. And that was affecting their experience as well as the experience of their peers around them. And really seeing that knowing that there's really good evidence-based best practices out there. But yet, because of the design of our current educational system, teachers really were not experiencing the kind of professional development or having the opportunity to dive into appropriate professional development that really led to significant change. And so I was really driven to be able to take what I knew to be best practice and then explore further around, and that's really where I pulled in interviews from 18 different experts in various fields, education, psychology, and neuroscience, to really pull everything together to create one accessible resource so that if one individual teacher wanted to make a change, they could have a synthesis in one book that would allow them to start to change little things that felt doable, as well as whole systems and districts that could embody and take on the framework.
Yeah, and it really is it's a tough time out there. It's a tough time out there, both for our kids as well as our educators. And, I think about some of the, the challenges. And of course, I think things have been challenging for some time. But certainly going through a global pandemic did not help things at all. Going through the global pandemic, not only were we all kind of experiencing this kind of global trauma and I especially think about kids and youth that were going through this, and for someone like myself that's been around the planet for a while, a couple of years is a small part of my life, but if you're 8 years old or 10 years old or 6 years old or 12 years old, 2 years of the world being unsafe, of like being afraid to be near people. It really was, I think, a pretty significant experience that we all had. And of course, I remember having conversations with folks about, what it's going to look like when schools begin to come back in person. And some wise people, saying, hey, this is going to be tough. Having everybody been through this trauma, having kind of uprooted some of the, the safety. It's not just about kind of academic loss, but it's about, kind of misconnection, missed opportunity, an unsafe world. So I think many people probably began to anticipate that things would be difficult. But of course, as we often do, we focus very highly on the academic part, and we forget about the importance of that underlying safety. And of course, you're rooted, some of this work is rooted in polyvagal, which of course makes me think about kind of this need for safety being kind of a paramount piece of all of this. If we want to learn, before we can, access our cortex, we've got to feel safe and feel connected. So, it's been tough for a while, and life continues to throw things at educators. There are communities that teachers are demonized for books in their classroom or other things. And of course, this leads to, unfortunately, a situation where, you mentioned we're losing a lot of educators. In many places, we don't have We don't have the number of school counselors and therapists and psychologists and other folks that we really critically need. So this is tough, and I'm sure, kind of coming from the background that you were coming from in counseling, you began to realize this, this really tough place that we are. But I think this is one of the reasons that this kind of work is important, because the only way we're going to get out of this and change things and get moving in a better direction is that, if we're making a positive difference for educators, right? If we're creating an experience that people are going into and not regretting their choices and thinking that they made a mistake, right? If we want to be able to retain and bring new people into the profession, things have to change, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, and one of my goals for the book is to integrate it into curriculum in pre-service educator programs. So I've been talking with various colleges and universities to integrate it as a required resource, because, we need to have the right tools to do a good job. And the research shows that even today, there's a lot of educator prep programs that are not teaching teachers how to support the well-being of themselves and their students, and to support what I call the functional success of students. And so to have something like my book as a resource for educators as they're moving through their program is only fair, and sets them up for success as they enter the workforce.
Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, and you bring up a great point. Unfortunately, sometimes higher ed lags behind, and there are many people going through current programs and preparing for careers in teaching that aren't getting some of the best and latest information that we have, and are often getting ideas around behavior management, things that really are not working. So, I mean, there absolutely is a need for change upstream. I want to shift gears for a second and just go back a little further in time. So, you mentioned kind of getting into the book, kind of taking these ideas and best practices that you had been learning and diving into. But let's start from the point that, the things that you're talking about here in this book are not by any means necessarily common knowledge in schools, even though we might agree that one day we'd like them to be. As a counselor, how did you begin diving into some of this information, thinking about things like, the neuroscience and the Polyvagal Theory? Like, tell us a little bit about your journey. Because I'm guessing that, some of this is often the case, was probably self-directed learning and exploration. But what was your journey like? How did you begin to, kind of become aware of some of this information that you've now taken into the book?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I first moved into the first K-8 school that I worked in, I became familiar with Leah Kuyper's zones of regulation programming, and really saw how effective that was when implemented correctly with kids. And then when I moved into my second K-8 school, they had already had a tier 1 program that was a collaborative experience between a special educator and an occupational therapist. And that team brought me in, and it was a tier 1 program that was at the first grade level. And over time, the special educator left, and the occupational therapist and I really grew the program. So it became a K-2 program, and we called it Movement and Mindfulness. And we utilized the zones of regulation. We utilized Michelle Garcia Winner's social thinking program, utilized some of Mind Up, and then created a lot of our own programming. And what I was really seeing both in that movement and mindfulness program and in my individual and group sessions as a school counselor was that when I started to talk about the brain and the body, and when I started to help kids, really teach kids and help them become what we call the brain scientists, what it did is it really validated and normalized their experience. And so it became less about like, oh my goodness, I'm experiencing this. What does this mean about me? to, oh, of course I'm experiencing this. This is human. And as soon as that validation and normalization happened, and they were able to accept and appreciate their experience, it really opened the door to them being ready to learn some management tools. But before that happened, a lot of times there was the barrier of stigma, the barrier of what does this mean if I acknowledge this? And it really prevented any forward movement in terms of self-management and skill building. And so I really just started to see that the neuroscience just opened the door in such a healthy way. And I just ran with that and just continued to really dive into it. And that's where I found Dr. Laurie Desautel's work and really dove into Stephen Porges's work and, started to read Dr. Mona Delahooke's books and really get into further understanding the neuroscience. And it's just continued to be really the foundation for all the work I do. Because it just opens that door.
Yeah, I happen to be a big believer that once you see the neuroscience, you can't unsee it. Once you begin to see behavior, whether it's your own behavior or the behavior of someone else, through the lens of the brain and the body, through the lens of neuroscience, you see behavior differently. And that gives you an opportunity to respond differently. And a different response is really what's needed in this time. A lot of what we're doing, and of course, I'm not at all a big proponent of a lot of the traditional approaches that are still very prevalent in many classrooms. A lot of the approaches are really heavily kind of based on behaviorism and kind of reward and consequence models. And kind of the idea that all behavior is volitional, all behavior is a choice. And as you begin to dive into the brain science and, realize, a little bit about, brain development and how development of the brain happens. And, you begin to understand the stress response system. It's a game changer. And of course, you mentioned that in the context of and I love this because I think it's really important. I think when you give kids, when you begin to teach this to children, when I love how you said to kind of normalize it, like, it's part of being human, right? When you teach people about kind of the neuroscience here and they understand like, because kids internalize things. They internalize the labels that are attached to them when they're not meeting the expectations that are given to them when they sometimes don't have the capability of meeting those expectations and, might see themselves as bad kids but when you begin to move and shift the way that you're looking at behavior, I think it really does change everything. It's such a big shift. The question for you though is I think I know the answer here, but in my mind, even more important than the children learning this, and I think is really critical, is getting the adults to learn this. And this is not common knowledge still, right? Most adults walking around this planet today don't really think about their stress response system or how they are wired for safety and survival, or how that response that they gave when they were feeling really dysregulated, well, that happened because their cortex went offline because they were so dysregulated. Like, most of us still don't have a lot of awareness, a lot of kind of neuro awareness, let's say, of our own brain and body. So tell me a little bit about kind of your thoughts on that in terms of adults first, right? How do we get the adults to learn this and shift their mindset?
Absolutely. Yeah. And 100%, oftentimes in working with teachers, I have teachers that say, how can I just be regulated all the time? How can I just be calm all the time?
And you can't, and that shouldn't be your goal, right? It's not about being regulated all the time, right? It's normal to move in and out, right?
And so really that's the first clue to me that, okay, they haven't yet been taught the neuroscience and the nuance of this, right? And so no, it's not common knowledge. And that's really where I get so excited, is to be able to teach this. And in developing my framework, I prioritize what I call developing the builder, because what I saw, not only do I see that this is not common knowledge for educators, but I also saw that talking about the self as a teacher, as we were working with trying to identify how to best support kids, it was very taboo to talk about how the educator was having a role within the intervention or within the support, because the systems were not set up in a way that really felt safety to be able to talk about that. Meaning that if we have a situation where a student is really struggling and we come together at the table to try to figure out how can we best support this student, I was often finding that 95% of the conversation was about the student. And we rarely ever talked about what the educator was doing or not doing when it came to their own regulation. Right. And there was a lot of fear around going there because there was oftentimes a lot of personalization that happened. And I believe that the personalization happens out of a fear that if we talk about this, this is going to look badly and be reflected poorly in their evaluation, and then they may not have a job. Mm-hmm. Right. And so in creating this framework, it was so important to me to have this be a system-wide approach, so that from the top, we can be implementing this framework, and we can start with this developing the builder meaning the educator and the leader, so that we really prioritize that this is for all of us, and we have to understand it intellectually, understand it as a lived experience, try it out through growth mindset, and before we're able to really do this well with kids.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, so often, and as you were saying that, it just, kind of really resonating with me, but so often we put all of the onus on, when a child is having a difficult time meeting the expectations that are placed on them, we put all the onus on the child who has the least developed brain, the least amount of experience, the least, and we don't think about what do we need to change with the adults that are supporting the child? What do we need to change with the environment? What are the stressors that might be impacting this child? And even just understanding the impact that it has on the nervous system, understanding, what happens when any of us are dysregulated? What happens to, when we go into a fight or flight response mode and our cortex kind of, we flip our lid, as Dan Siegel might say, we're not thinking logically or rationally at that moment. What happens? And, often our responses are aligned for a child that's fully online for children that aren't. Children that are dysregulated, that are having a difficult time. So I think that's really important. So let's dive in a little bit. So what I want to do, if you're okay with it, is I want you to tell us, so you as a counselor had this experience. You began to go on your own journey here of really diving into work of people like Steve Porges and Mona Delahooke and others, and diving into this neuroscience piece and kind of coming up with these thoughts and ideas. And ultimately that led you to develop this framework. What I want to do, if you are okay with it, is I'd like to share your slides. You've got a couple slides, and have you talk a little bit about this framework that you put together and how it then relates to the book. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up on the stage here your slide deck, and I'll let you kind of go ahead and navigate through it.
Excellent. That sounds great. Thank you. So this was just we skipped all the way to the end. Here we go. Okay. So this is just a visual for the framework. I like analogies because I think they can sometimes be helpful in grounding us. So this analogy is the way that we can build a house. And as I mentioned, I'm prioritizing developing the builder. The builder is the educator. And when I say educator, I mean any adult who is working in a school, whether it's the administrator, paraprofessional, educator, teacher, classroom teacher. And so the framework is really starting and prioritizing the educator. I was beginning to develop this framework where I was feeling like this would be the last place that schools would want to go to. I was feeling like what would draw them into the work was maybe they might be looking for a social emotional learning work, or they might be looking for trauma responsive work. But what really is heartening to me is the schools that are reaching out to me are ready to start with developing the builder, which is so exciting to me. So I just wanted to share that as much as we see that this work has not infiltrated, the schools to the degree that we want to, I am seeing that schools are really ready for this, and it's really exciting for the work as a whole. So I have 5 different competencies that all relate to this kind of analogy. So this first one is developing the builder, and then we have pouring the foundation, framing the structure, furnishing the space, and then living in the space. And I'll just have a slide per competency. So as I mentioned, this first one is developing the builder. And the big idea of this is really to increase self-awareness and then increase self-management, right? So the more we know ourselves, the more we know our activators, what shifts us into a state of protection, what helps us shift back into a state of connection, right? The more we know ourselves, the more we're going to be able to successfully implement self-management strategies. When we're able to do that well, it increases our effectiveness as a co-regulator for our students. And so as we mentioned, the goal is never to be calm all the time, because that's just simply not human, right? But the goal is to be able to be aware of ourselves and manage our states as they shift in a way that is responsive and effective. When we're doing that well, then at a tier 1 level, meaning for everybody in the classroom, we're going to be emitting energy that is calm and increasing the likelihood that our students are going to experience felt safety by our leadership in the room. And our calm is then beginning their calm. So it's helping them to experience that felt safety, which helps them to feel regulated and further sustain and longer sustain their state of regulation, which allows, as you mentioned, their thinking brain or their prefrontal cortex, that learning brain, to be activated, right? And we need that activated in order to learn the academic material that is before them.
Yeah, and I just was going to jump in real quick. I mean, I think that self-awareness piece is so critical. Because again, this absolutely starts with the adults. It absolutely starts with adults understanding and understanding their own brain and body and nervous system, and I think that understanding better equips you to not only do the critical things that as educators that we can do to help support children and each other, like co-regulation. But it also, I think, puts us in a position where we can give ourselves a little grace. I mean, realize that we too are human, that we too will become dysregulated, that our goal is not necessarily about being regulated all the time. But I think that awareness is really critical, because I think that many people lack that awareness. And, sometimes we're our own hardest critic as well. And if any time in history was, time that this is needed, I think, allowing yourself grace through learning some of this can really be powerful. So I think that I love, I love that you start here with kind of this idea of developing the builder, because it really does begin with us. The quote, a dysregulated adult is never going to help a dysregulated child, really is meaningful. And focusing on your own regulation and understanding is so foundational to being able to help anyone else.
Absolutely. Yeah. And what this really does is it opens the door to put joy back in teaching. And that's why educators went into this field, right? Almost every educator that I talk with had some experience or some passion around wanting to help kids, and they found joy in that. And the more that we're able to increase our self-awareness and self-management, the more joy we experience in the profession. So then, so that's kind of the big idea of this competency. And then there are these 3 bullet points that really kind of dig in a little bit deeper. So the goal and the work within this competency is cultivating that strong self-awareness, cultivating cultivating effective self-management strategies. And that's going to look different for every person. And then engaging in productive utilization of self. And what I mean by that is, as I mentioned, using ourselves as co-regulators when we can, using ourselves as a model for how we respond to our dysregulated states. And as well as using ourself and our strengths. So there's been some messaging over time of kind of like leaving ourselves at the door as we enter the classroom. What I find to be more effective is to be very nuanced about this, right? So we want to make sure that we have good boundaries with kids. That's super important. But we can't leave our full selves at the door, because what makes an educator so effective is when they bring their strengths forward in a way that really helps to build their connection with kids, because those positive relationships are critical. And if we never bring ourselves to the classroom and our strengths, then we minimize our ability to more effectively engage in those positive relationships. So I do a lot of teaching around what is appropriate and what is within the role of the educator.
Yeah. It's an interesting point. And you know, in my mind, one of the things that's really important in any relationship is to be authentic. And, you know, it's not a matter of just, you know, developing a rapport to satisfy a box to say, well, I built I mean, it really is about being authentic, and kids see right through things that are inauthentic, even if the intention behind them is genuine. And recognizing that, you know, certainly there are boundaries and limits to know. At the same time, I think, you know, having that ability to, you know, when we talk about relationship, it's not just something that should be done to say, well, you know, there's got to be a sincere, authentic effort, I think. And we all, I think, do our best for the people that we know, we like, we're connected to. And, you know, it's so critical.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. So that's the big idea of the developing the builder. Oops, it went all the way to the end again. Sorry about that.
Oh, no worries.
Okay. The second competency is pouring the foundation. So the big idea of this is really engaging in an authoritative plus educational neuroscience leadership style. So let me unpack that a bit. The research on leadership styles really shows three main styles. There's the authoritarian leadership style, which is historically what we've seen in education as well as in parenting. And that's the like my way or the highway leadership style. And what we saw in research and over time through experience is that kids often will experience fear from that leadership style. So it's very punitive based. It's not relationship engaging. And oftentimes it can be enticing for educators to utilize that style because they may see like compliance from students. However, that compliance is happening not out of an intrinsic wanting to do well, but it's out of fear. And so what we see over time is that when that authoritarian leadership style is utilized, it really creates a chasm in that positive student-educator relationship. And it creates behaviors in students such as cheating or just doing the work just to do the work, but not really engaging in it and understanding it. And so what we saw as a culture really is that we wanted to shift away from this authoritarian leadership style. Do I still see it pop up? Absolutely. But it's not best practice. And so, but as a whole, what we saw was this kind of pendulum swing to what we call a permissive leadership style. So educators were really seeing like, okay, I don't want to be authoritarian. I understand that it's important to have connection with kids. But yet they didn't really know then, they didn't have the tools for how to hold boundaries. because they knew they didn't want to be punitive, but they didn't know what else to do. And so this ended up, and this is where I see a lot of school systems and individual educators still in this, like really getting really good at the positive student educator relationship, but not knowing how to effectively hold boundaries. And what happens is when we have educators that aren't holding those boundaries, it actually creates a decrease in felt safety, because students need to know where that boundary is to be able to feel like they're contained in a healthy way. To know where that boundary is, their peers need to know that the boundary is going to be held. When I look at permissive classrooms, I see a lot of peer-to-peer conflict because the peers are trying to take on that role of creating that container. And so what is healthy and best practice for classrooms and for schools, it's to have this middle ground approach that's called authoritative. So this approach is rooted in positive connection, but it has clear, explicit, and enforced high expectations for kids. And with this, I go into a lot of detail around how schools and educators can implement this, including having consequences or experiences, as Dr. Lori Desautels talks about, that are skill building in nature. So we want, when a student makes a mistake, we want to have them engage in an experience that is going to make it more likely for them to be successful in that experience when they see a similar experience in the future. So the consequences need to be skill building in nature. We need to set them up for success, both environmentally and skill-wise. And we need to make sure that they're having opportunities to repair relationships if the situation calls for it. So that's that authoritative leadership style. And then we need to pair it with educational neuroscience. So not only does the adult need to know educational neuroscience themselves and understand how the brain and body works and how we shift between physiological states, but we need to be explicitly teaching that to kids as well. But first, in this pouring the foundation competency, this is where educators really learn what authoritative leadership is, what educational neuroscience is, and really start to learn how to embody that. And what this does is it creates an increase in felt safety and it empowers learners. So
I just wanted to kind of bring a rambling up here. So bear with me here if I can get to where I'm headed. As I was listening to you talk about kind of this idea of authoritative, I'm always very careful around consequences. And I guess the concern that I have is related to stress responses. And of course, looking at children through a lens of neuroscience, knowing that much of the behavior we see, and I think if we look at younger children, even a greater proportion of the behavior that we see is often based in a stress response, is often based in kind of our bodies being wired for survival. And, so one of the concerns that I sometimes have is around, as adults, we love the idea of consequences. I struggle because I think that when we're talking about stress responses, I think we need to be really careful there because providing a punitive consequence, and even if well-intentioned, sometimes the consequences still kind of lean on the punitive side. For a child that's having a stress response is not ultimately, I think, something that will better equip that child in the future. But it's a very natural response from an adult, like, oh, we need more consequences. Well, I realize that may have been a stress response, but they still need a consequence for that action. And of course, I'm always in the boat of, kind of how do we really take that apart and understand, what was the stressor? What was it, kind of going into Dan Siegel's work, like what pushed them out of their window of tolerance and what might have led to that behavior? And of course, then what can we do to relieve some of those stressors? Because, none of us are at our best when we're dysregulated, right? And all of us have said or done something that we later regretted in that moment of dysregulation. And of course, the biggest consequence as an adult is that you feel horrible, because when I was really upset about something and somebody asked me a question and I snapped at them for no fault of their own, well, I was dysregulated, right? And I feel terrible about that. But I'm wondering, because again, I know that, people have different, kind of different thoughts and ideas around this. But, I still struggle from time to time with really balancing what we know in the neuroscience, with things like consequences. And I'm not saying that there's never a situation where, consequences are either A, natural, or B, something that might be needed in a situation. But I also am very, very concerned anytime, people begin to kind of move into a consequences direction where there is clearly it's a matter of stress and dysregulation and unmet, very often, for instance, in the work that we do, when we see a child that's gotten to the point where they were restrained or secluded or had other punitive things done to them, if you really dive into the situations, you very often find at the heart of it was an unmet need, right? Was a child whose needs were not being appropriately met, which led to, something happen. So how do you, and again, I don't want to put words in your mouth about what your thoughts or feelings might be, but I'm kind of wondering what your thoughts and feelings might be, and how you, because again, as adults, sometimes that's our leaning, well, they need a consequence for that. And again, anytime we can have some growth through people becoming more aware of their brain and their body and their nervous system, and understanding and making plans for reducing stress and addressing these things, I think that's really productive. But how do you find balance with that? Because that can be, I think, a little tricky.
Yeah. So I think it's really, so I love that you just brought all of that up, because this really gets us into the nuance of this work and where we can really see this move in a healthy direction, right? So when it's almost like really looking at the word discipline and what it really means,
Yep.
right? So like we throw around the word discipline, and automatically most of us have the connotation of like a punitive punishment, right? But really the word discipline means to teach. So similarly, consequence has also had maybe a little bit softer, but this like, you're going to be quote unquote in trouble, right? But really the word consequence is really, this is in response to something that happened. So if we look at a situation where a student was dysregulated and perhaps there was a behavior that happened, right? Historically, without understanding this work and without understanding the neuroscience, historically, the consequence has been primarily focused on the student and the behavior. But what we're looking at in this model and in this framework is, what is the consequence from a system-wide perspective, right? So we saw what happened. We need to now look at, so like the behavior was just probably like the red flag indicator that something's up. But that is one slice of the pie of everything that was going on in the environment. And so that's when earlier I talked about like looking at the environment, right? And so what's important is that we're not setting kids up for failure in the way of continuing to put them in similar situations over and over again if they don't have the skills and the support necessary, right? So when we talk about consequences, we want to be improving the whole system that is supporting the student, rather than historically just looking at what that student can do differently. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So the consequence is like this system wide. Let's reflect on, were the adults regulated? What were the factors at play? What do we know what shifted the student into a state of dysregulation? What can we do proactively to support that student, prior and in the moment better? Right? Does this mean that this student needs an increase in supervision, or to be successful, more scaffolded support, right? So it's this broader context of talking about consequences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I appreciate that. I appreciate that clarification. I think it's really important because I think that again, and when I knew exactly where you were headed with discipline. It's something I talk about a lot. I mean, it comes from a root word which means to teach, right? So, but very often people think about discipline as being punitive, and of course, one of the ironies is that punitive discipline is quite dysregulating. So when you're giving out punitive discipline, you're often sending somebody out of their cortex, which is ironic here because if you really want to teach people, you need them in their cortex, right? So some of the ideas around discipline are really, kind of not only outdated, but they're just not right. And both compliance and consequence are always words that concern me a little bit. And I always talk about, when it comes to compliance, like, yes, we want a child that's able to get along with others and understand that there's boundaries and there's rules and all of that is great. But sometimes the focus is far too heavy in the direction of compliance. And I think that is often what leads a kid who begins to have a hard time down that path. And when they're becoming dysregulated and met with more compliance demands, that's what escalates rather than de-escalates and often leads to bigger behaviors. Thank you. I appreciate that. It just, as I hear often as we're talking, and again, there's a lot of work being done out there, but I always am concerned in thinking when thinking about stress responses and being sure that we're not punishing somebody for their body doing what their body was programmed to do, but being mindful and reflective and thinking about the things that we can do to truly, kind of prevent that in the future or provide them the support and the skills or understand the stressors that might have led to that. So I appreciate that.
Absolutely. And then the other piece to this is really making sure that we're utilizing strengths-based approaches, right? So how can we be looking at what the student's strengths are? What are they doing well? Oftentimes when we are looking at how to create interventions to best support kids, a lot of schools are still very much in a deficit model. So it's so critically important to be building from a strengths-based model. So that's the other tenet of pouring the foundation. So let's see if I cannot skip slides here. Here we go.
There you go.
So the third competency is framing the structure. So the big idea here is proactively creating predictable experiences. So there's so much that we can do ahead of time. Often educators, rightly so, but really want to know, like, what can I do in the moment? But we need to really be first thinking about what are we doing proactively before we're in that moment of stress, because there's so much that we can do. And so when we're very clear with our expectations, when we're explicitly teaching educational neuroscience, this is the competency where we're explicitly teaching it to the students. When we're fostering engagement through building intrinsic motivation, moving far away from rewards and punishments, but working to engage students through fostering autonomy, having choice, fostering belonging, right? Now we're providing clarity on what those expectations are, including what's going to happen when we make mistakes. And I do a lot of work with educators on shifting language so that we're talking about, we're saying things to students such as when we make mistakes, to really normalize that mistakes are happening all the time. And that helps to, again, take away some of that stigma, take away shame when students do experience mistakes. And it really helps students to have this, to shift. It helps them to shift back into their state of connection and regulation quicker. So when I was working as a school counselor, a lot of times I would work in responsive situations where a student was engaged in a conflict or they had a behavior when they were dysregulated, and I would go to them or they would come to my space. And a lot of times what was keeping them dysregulated was this fear of what the consequence was going to be, what is going to happen as a result. And as soon as they understood what the next steps were going to be, it decreased their anxiety around it. And then they started to be able to shift back into a state of connection and then be able to really move through the moment. And so we can do so much to help support felt safety and regulation by explicitly being really clear ahead of time with students and engaging them in the process of what is going to work best, how they're going to be best supported through moments of dysregulation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I love that you, we're talking about like moving past rewards and really focusing on like how we develop kind of that confidence and intrinsic motivation. So much of what is done is really based on rewards and consequences, right? But probably not the same kind that we were talking about a moment ago. But so much of it is based on kind of this idea that it's a matter of choice and a matter of motivation, right? When your response is rewards or punishment, you're often looking at through the lens of behavior being a choice. You're making bad choices, and you looking through that lens, you think, well, gee, if only there was something to motivate them to make the right choice, instead of realizing and looking through kind of the neuroscience aligned lens and realizing that this may be something that we're seeing because this is a child who is for one reason or another experiencing stress and maybe having stress behavior. I think that's really important. So I appreciate you sharing that. I think it's a critical move in this work is moving away from a lot of these approaches that really are, and again, while many people have moved past some of the punitive approaches, there's still a lot of work around, oh, well, let's, it's the carrot end of things, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what this does is it really helps to, what I was going to say was I like to use the analogy of we would never ask a person in a wheelchair to run, right? So like that's so clear to us when we can see something physical as a physical barrier, yet oftentimes we're asking a student who is shifting into dysregulation or a student who doesn't yet have the skills or doesn't have all of their needs met to complete a task in order to be rewarded. We would never do that. We would never say, okay, if a person in a wheelchair, if you run, then you can have such and such. Right. So to sometimes using that physical analogy helps to have educators really buy in and understand what we're asking is completely unfair.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
All right. The fourth competency is furnishing the space. And so this is where we really dive deeply into how to create this positive student-educator relationship and how we can routinely prioritize regulatory practices. So I often find that when we're talking about positive student-educator relationships, it's something that it has this feeling of like common sense that people should know how to have these relationships. And yet what I find is that they come naturally for some educators, but they don't come naturally for other educators. And for the educators where it doesn't come naturally, they were oftentimes never given explicit instruction how to have these relationships. And so it can feel really stigmatizing to say, how do I do that? Because it's just one of these things that's expected. And so this is where we really dive into the nuances and specifics of how to engage in the positive relationship, especially with students who are seemingly not wanting that relationship. And I talk a lot about why they may be having behaviors or sending clues or sending messages that may give you the perception that they don't want that relationship. but we're inherently wired for connection. And so teaching the neuroscience of that is really critical to helping educators see that those students who are giving off those messages actually need that positive relationship the most.
Yeah. Great point. And you know, I mean, I think another thing to always keep in mind here is that, you know, the lived experience of an individual, you know, may have led them to a point where the adults in their lives have not been reliable or trustworthy or there for them, or, you know, I mean, so you know, there certainly can be a connection there with trauma and past experiences, and reasons why a child might be seeming to push you away when you're trying to be there to support them. And your statement is absolutely, I mean, the kids that sometimes need that the most are the ones that are going to be the least receptive to it.
Absolutely. Yep. And then the other part of this is the regulatory practices. And so we want to be looking at this from a tier 1 level first, meaning that there's this quote that I love by Sylvia Ashton Warner. She wrote a book called Teacher, I believe, years ago, like in the 60s. And she has this quote that as much as we're breathing in information, we need to breathe out. So meaning a lot of schools, because of the pressure of getting through a certain amount of curriculum, kids are going through their days being pushed in information. And so it's almost like a fire hydrant effect of receiving information. We can't effectively learn that way. We need to be able to breathe in information and then breathe out information. And so I challenge educators to really audit their experiences that they're providing to students, whether they're a middle school or high school teacher where they have them for a certain block of time, or where they're an elementary school teacher where they have them all day, to be looking at, are they really balancing the breathing in and the breathing out of information? In those breathing out moments, that's when our brains really integrate and understand the information on a deeper level. And this is where we get to really pay specific attention to our regulation, right? So by creating a schedule where we're engaging in direct learning experiences and then breathing out that information, that can look like providing classroom-wide experiences where students are really trying out different regulation practices. So maybe that is the teacher explicitly providing breathing exercises, movement exercises, sensory-based exercises, journaling, right? Like really going through and teaching and modeling all of these different regulatory practices that students can be trying out so that they can learn what works best for them, right? So we're doing it on a routine basis, which then leads into my goal is for every educator to have their own, what I call EASE plan. And so that stands for Emotional Alarm System Engagement Plan. So when we talk about like all the educational neuroscience around how our brain and body work, I talk about that as our emotional alarm system, right? So the EASE plan is how we engage with our alarm system. Our alarm system is happening automatically. Our engagement is a response to that automatic reaction, right? So in the ideal, during the developing the builder phase, the educator is coming up with their own EASE plan. And then in the furnishing the space phase, they're then teaching and helping each student in their classroom to come up with their own EASE plan. So that when a student is experiencing a moment of dysregulation, they already have a plan of how to support their dysregulation. That may include co-regulation, as well as other regulatory practices that they've already had experience practicing and utilizing. So then the fifth competency is living in the space. And this is where we're really integrating social emotional learning, trauma responsive care, mental health literacy, and equity practices within the fabric of what we're doing on an everyday basis. And when we do this, the result is that each student receives an equitable experience based on their needs. I often like to really clarify, like, most people understand, the field of social emotional learning. Most people understand what trauma responsive work is, and equity practices, but the field of mental health literacy is rather new. And so I like to just always use this as an opportunity to kind of teach what that is, because you had mentioned COVID earlier. And when COVID happened, one of the things that I noticed was that because we were doing a good job of really messaging to educators that we needed educators to be taking care of themselves, and we also needed educators to be focusing on and recognizing the mental health and the well-being of their students, there became a legitimate confusion around what the role of the educator was. And a lot of times educators were saying, whoa, like, I'm not a therapist, I'm not a counselor. How am I supposed to be looking at mental health? And so what mental health literacy is saying, no, it's really important that educators understand that we're not asking them to be counselors or therapists, because that's not their job. They're not trained for that. That's not their role. But mental health literacy is it's almost like mental health first aid, right? So physical first aid, we go take classes on understanding the signs and symptoms of, what a heart attack is, how to, put a Band-Aid on and clean minor wounds, right? So understanding kind of that baseline physical health response. This is similar. So mental health literacy is understanding what are the signs and symptoms of a mental health challenge, so that educators are empowered to know when to wrap in the mental health professionals and the caregivers and parents into the situation. Educators are in a prime position to be able to see, especially as students reach adolescence, there's a lot of confusion for parents around what is typical adolescent behavior and when do they really need to be worried about a mental health challenge. Because educators see so many students of the same age group over time, they get a real sense of what is typical for that age group that parents don't often have. And so when educators are given the information around, here's the signs and symptoms of mental health challenges, now they can be they can have a response to say, okay, I'm seeing a mental health challenge, and loop in the mental health professional and the parent so that they can then take it from there. The other piece of that is understanding the basic messaging and wordage that can be used that promotes positive mental health or that detracts from overall mental health.
So those are kind of the tiers of the framework, right? Now, so the book talks about the framework, but then goes beyond that. And you mentioned kind of in the beginning of these experts that contributed to the book. Tell me a little bit more about that. So, in the book, we've got the the framework and kind of laying that out. But what is this about kind of the experts, and what are the contributions, and who are some of the experts that you had involved in the book?
Yeah, thanks for asking. It was so fun to interview all of these experts, and I'm just, forever grateful for their generosity and time and willingness to be a part of the project. I really believe in the collective wisdom. We all have our own, lived experience, but we're one, I'm one person. And I really wanted to make sure that I created a resource, and this is the book here, that was accessible, meaning that it wasn't too long, although, there's a lot of information in there.
Probably more you had to leave out, right? I mean,
yes.
There's always more you want to say, right?
Yes, to give a little bit of insight into that. When I passed in the first draft, I had to cut out about half of it. So yeah, there's so much, but this is the synthesized version, which is better in lots of ways, but in the way of really making it feel like a doable read for educators. But I really wanted to give voice to a diverse collection of experts. And so I thought about, who from the fields of psychology, education, and neuroscience, in terms of experts that are really working with the research and doing this work, as well as on the ground educators who are still in the classroom. And so, I had mentioned Leah Kuipers earlier. So Leah offered an interview, and it was fantastic to work with her. And she has a new digital curriculum coming out soon that's really exciting. She and I were able to team a graphic that shows up in my book and will also show up in her curriculum. Really linking the zones of regulation curriculum with polyvagal theory, and understanding how the zones of regulation and the states of polyvagal theory really align to really show the neuroscience behind her work. And so that was really exciting to be able to co-create that with her and have her thoughts on really clarifying what regulation is and how best to support it. So that was really fun to work with her. Dr. Kenneth Ginsberg is a doctor out of Philadelphia, and he runs the Center for Teen and Parent Communication. He created this intervention. So he has lots of awesome quotes that I talk about in the book, and he's really an expert with adolescents. He created this intervention that I call the collaboration for, I'm mixing up the name right now, but essentially he talks about it as this 2-minute intervention that he allowed me to create a visual for, and the visuals in the book. And it's this strengths-based approach that feels really doable for educators. And it's been really fun to do a lot of work with educators around the book and to see who picks up this as something that resonates with them. I was just working with an educator the other day that had talked about how she saw this, and what she was doing with the student that she was working with was not being effective. She then learned about this intervention and utilized it, and it just made a world of difference. So essentially what it is, it's this strengths-based approach that really, he talks about how, when we think about our heart, right? He says, this is why I care about you. So it starts off with like that positive student connection, that care, because I can't tell you how many times I sat in meetings where educators talked about how much they cared about students. And then I would go meet with a student, and the student would say, nobody cares about me. Right. And so there's this huge disconnect between what's actually experienced, what the educator is feeling, and what the student is actually experiencing. So to explicitly say, like, heart, this is why I care about you, right? Head, this is why I worry about you, right? So now we're creating like an understanding about why we're having this conversation. Hands, what do you need to be supported? And then how can I help you get there? Right. So we're really empowering and engaging the student to be part of this solution. Yeah. And as Dr. Ginsberg says, the student is the expert. A lot of times I see educators who are doing a lot of work around how to support students and never asking the student what their opinion is. And we need to start with the student, because they're their own expert. Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think the power and need to collaborate with kids is so great. Very often it's adults making all the decisions, and yet it's the kid's life, right? It's on the line here. So we're getting towards the end of our time here, but there's a couple more things I wanted to ask you. One, we've talked a lot about schools and education. The book, who's this for? Is it just for teachers? Might it be helpful to families or counselors or others? Who's really the audience here for the book? Who would you recommend it for? Yeah, great question. So the audience is for the educator. It's written for the educator. As I said earlier, the educator is really anybody who works in a school. However, I have a lot of parents who are reading it as well.
Hmm.
I really wanted this to be a book that spoke both to the educator and the parent, but in order for it to be short enough to be accessible, I needed to pick an audience. My goal is to be able to eventually have a companion guide that is directly for educators. But like I said, I have educators that are using it as well, because it's information about humans and how we
Hmm.
can
Hmm.
support humans. And so it can really be for parents as well.
Hmm. 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 That's great. So where can people get the book?
So on Amazon, as well as on the John Catt website, which is the publisher.
Gotcha. Kind of as we're getting to wrap up here, aside from the book, what else do you do? Do you do consulting? Are you taking this model into schools? Are you working? So tell us a little bit more about your work. And I know that you've got a great website that people can go to learn more, but tell us a little bit about, kind of the other areas that you focus on in your work.
Yeah, absolutely. So I do consulting with schools. I do educator coaching for individual educators. What I'm most passionate about is bringing this to districts as a whole, because when we can have this be from a district leadership perspective, now we're really infiltrating the framework into policies and practices, and that's going to have that trickle down effect to be able to best support educators and best support students as a whole.
Gotcha. And I pulled up your website here as well, and would encourage people to check out your website. And I think one important point here, and I'm with you. I mean, I think the things that you brought in this book, these are things that a teacher can certainly begin to implement in their own work, in their own classroom. But the real change here happens when a school or a district begins to look at this more widely and how they might apply it. And I think one of the things that's important, and I guess one of the things I would say in terms of kind of that parent audience, again, I can speak from personal experience and the experience of a lot of parents that are members of our community. Parents can be change makers sometimes and can help bring things to school districts. And, again, if this, is something that kind of interests you, if you're out there listening to this today, I encourage you, share this interview with, a superintendent or an administrator or someone within the district. Very often we see, parents making recommendations and, not to say that every school is receptive, but there are certainly a lot of schools that are. And, so I would encourage you, if you're a parent and interested in this work, check out the book. And this is ways that we can help bring about change in schools, is by, kind of advocating for different approaches. So I know we are just about at time here, but I want to give you an option if there's anything final you want to leave us with, any final words, your hope for this book and the work that you're doing, anything you want to share with us as we wrap up here today.
Yeah, a few things. So just to go along with what you just said, if there is somebody listening in the audience who is a parent and wants to bring this to their school, or even an individual educator that wants to bring this to the school, reach out to me directly as well, because I can provide free consultation sessions to just talk with your leadership around the work, what it is, and how we can embed it in the school. Secondly, my hope for this book is that it really helps to, and I've already started to see it, but it continues to be a change maker and really empower educators in school districts to best support students, because every student deserves to have an equitable and positive experience in school. These are foundational, critical years for our students. And it's so important that they are provided the support and experience that they deserve. And then thirdly, just wanted to again share my gratitude for being on this podcast, and you're doing such incredible things with the Alliance. And I'm so excited to be a part of this group of people and organizations who are really promoting this work.
I appreciate that, and appreciate the the passion you have, the work that you've been doing. I mean, I think again, I probably shared this with you before. There's a lot of amazing people out there doing a lot of incredible work, and many different approaches, and there's a lot that tie them together. At the end of the day, I'm always kind of like, I don't care which one you do, but pick one. Find something that works for you or works for your school, and do that. And I think you're bringing together actually a lot of I would actually say that what you're doing is actually far more comprehensive than many of the things that I've seen out there. And you're bringing a lot of very important pieces together here. So I think it will be really compelling for people that are looking for, what's a better way? What can we do differently? Thinking about your second point that you made, and then we'll wrap up and let everybody go. But thinking about that second point you made, I'll throw out to you an invitation that, when you have a school that you've been working with that has really done some fantastic work in bringing about change, I'd love to have you and maybe a school administrator or teacher or someone else join us for a future podcast to talk about how they implemented the program and how it helped them to move forward. So I'll just share that as we end, like, hey, there can be a part 2 to this, and wouldn't it be great? Because part of what we're doing when we do these programs is really trying to share with people what are some of the better things you can do? And the hope is that it inspires people, and inspires people to dig in deeper, to go to your website, to reach out to you. And, the hope is that then people, are trying things and moving in a better direction. So our hope is always to inspire people to try something and to move in a direction that can really result in, and I think, better outcomes for not just kids, but for teachers and staff as well. And that's really critical in these times. So consider that an open invitation. You let me know. We're booking out at a ways ahead. So we can put you on the calendar for next year already, and then figure out which school it's going to be. But thank you so much for spending this time with me today. I appreciate your work, as a counselor, as an educator, as somebody that, I can relate to this, like, has seen a problem in the world and now wants to help solve it. That's not easy work. And, I'm sure that the book was a labor of love, and the work that went into it was, I'm sure, very significant. So thank you so much for being here today. And with that, we're going to go ahead and let everybody go that's been on our live broadcast. And again, if you're not watching this live, thank you still for being part of the program. And by all means, share and come see us again soon. All right. Thank you so much. We will see you all again very soon. Bye-bye.